this is what we began, and we're still on track, I think, except in this talk, interestingly, I'm going to deal a little bit more with cosmic phenomena, which we haven't actually done thus far. So, in fact, I'm calling it Israel 3 because we're talking about Cataclysm in the land of Israel. And of course, going back a few times now, we considered the Battle of Jericho and then the Elijah earthquake, which brought up some interesting thoughts. Last time we spoke about the Amos earthquake, the earthquake in the days of King Uzziah, and then we thought of the Herod earthquake, as I'm calling it. This is the one in 31 BCE, but we're going to revisit it a little in this talk. But one of the things that has really taken my thinking of late is, what do I know about Herod the Great? What do we know about him? And probably the answer is, for most of us, not so much. If you look on Wikipedia, for example, you can determine that he was born around, that's the circa C. 72 BCE. The fact is, he wasn't of the tribes of Israel. He wasn't part of Jacob, because the Edomites are descended from Jacob's brother Esau. So it may be that the Edomites actually converted to Judaism, but he is not a direct descendant of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. We understand that he was appointed king of Judea by the Romans around 40 BCE, but he didn't actually become king of Jerusalem, so to speak, until 37 BCE. The question is, how do we know that? And of course, we have a historian to refer to, don't we? Josephus, that's true. I haven't got very far in my commitment to read the whole works of Josephus, because it is a massive undertaking, but I am going to try and refer to him as much as I can, because he was a very careful historian, and he's highly regarded. This is what it says in Book 17, Chapter 8, Stanza 1. Now, this is interesting because it's talking about the time when Herod died, which we'll get on to. When he had done these things, he died. We'll see what these things are a bit later. The 5th day, after he had caused Antipater to be slain. Now, Antipater was one of his sons. I don't know whether I'm actually saying the word correctly. Correct me if I'm wrong. Antipater was heir to the throne. He was slain. He was executed by his father Herod, having reigned since he had procured Antigonus, and again I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, to be slain. Antigonus was the last of the Hasmonean kings. The Hasmonean dynasty was essentially established in the 2nd century BC after the victory of the Maccabees over Antiochus Epiphanes. He was the last of the Hasmonean dynasty, Antigonus. We were going to have a new dynasty, which is the Herodian dynasty. So 34 years after that, but since he had been declared king by the Romans before he took Jerusalem, 37. So this is the very careful documentation by Josephus. But we can nevertheless really have to say that this is approximate, but pretty close, pretty accurate. The big question that divides different historians and biblical historians is, when did Herod die? This is the issue. The fact is, Josephus doesn't give us a date, but he gives us 3 clues. And these are really interesting clues. So we go back to the testimony of Josephus, Book 17, Chapter 6, Stanza 4, and I'm going to start at the beginning of Stanza 4 because it tells us something about Herod that we need to take on board. So here we get to Chapter 6, Stanza 4, the beginning. You can look it up. But the people, on account of Herod's barbarous temper, and for fear he should be so cruel and to inflict punishment on them, he, that's Herod of course, deprived Matthias of the high priesthood. Now it happened that during the time of the high priesthood of this Matthias, there was another person made high priest for a single day, that very day which the Jews observed as a fast. There are several fasts, but the fact is, clue number one about Herod's death is that there was a fast before he died. Now it goes on. Again, stanza 4. On the night before that day when the fast, this fast, was to be celebrated, Herod deprived this Matthias, so we're talking about the same period, of the high priesthood, and, take note, and burnt the other Matthias who had raised the sedition, so there was a rebellion, with his companions alive. They were burnt alive. And that very night there was an eclipse of the moon. So the second clue, we got a fast and we've got a lunar eclipse shortly before Herod dies. What's the third clue? Well, we know from what Josephus writes that Herod died before Passover, a Passover celebration. And we read this actually in two places, both in the Antiquities of the Jews but also in a subsequent work, The Jewish Wars. It says this, Book 2, Chapter 1, Stanza 3. And indeed, at the feast of unleavened bread, which was now at hand, and is by the Jews called the Passover. But the question we have to ask is, Herod died before Passover, but how long before Passover? We don't know the answer to that. But we do know from what Josephus wrote that at the time of this Passover that is being described in this passage in Josephus, that now Archelaus was the king of Judea. Now Archelaus was a surviving son and heir to Herod, Herod Archelaus. We read about him actually in Matthew chapter 2. So it's before Passover. Now, going back to the eclipse, what eclipse do we choose? Which sets the date of Herod's death? Well, the traditional one that is chosen is the lunar eclipse that takes place March 12th and March 13th in 4 BC. There are other factors, it is true, historical factors that need to be taken into account, but it is true that in the academic world, Herod's death is established as 4 BC. However, the eclipse that takes place at this time in 4 BC is only a partial eclipse, and it's also after midnight. It's not very notable, that eclipse. It's not startling, such that Josephus will have noted it. My own choice and I'm absolutely confident now in this choice, as we will see, is that the actual eclipse that Josephus talks about takes place on December the 29th, 1 BCE. So if this is true, what was the fast that Josephus also talks about? Well, I believe I can be confident in this, that it is one of the 4 minor fasts that the Jewish people celebrate. It's called the Fast of Tevet. What does the Fast of Tevet remember? It remembers the siege of Jerusalem that began on the 10th day of the 10th month. The 10th month is called Tevet. That's why it's the 10th day of Tevet. The siege that is remembered during this fast and mourning is the siege of Jerusalem that was in response to the rebellion of King Zedekiah, who was the last king before the destruction of Jerusalem under the leadership of Nebuchadnezzar. That siege lasted for about 18 months. And here you can see underneath it says this: so in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. That's the first verse of chapter 25 of the second book of Kings. Eventually, after that 18-month siege, when so many people within the city died, the city walls were breached. This was in the 4th month of the 11th year of King Zedekiah, and it is remembered in the fast of the 4th month. Shortly after that, in the 5th month, the temple is destroyed, and this is Tisha B'Av, and there is also another fast, the assassination of Gedaliah, in the 7th month. There are 4 minor fasts, but we're talking of the fast of Tevet. So I'm very confident that the eclipse, because it was very noticeable, it was seen in the early evening, and very dramatic. It's the most dramatic of all the eclipses that have actually been suggested. December 29th, 1 BC. Now, if this is true, and I absolutely believe it is, as I will show you in a minute, it means that Herod died before Passover, but the Passover of 1 AD in the modern era, 1 CE, sometimes it's called the Common Era. Well, this is different from 4 BC, isn't it, folks? So when was Jesus born? And I show this picture, although I think that there is a lot that one could say is inappropriate or incorrect. We don't know how many Magi were there, but I use this as a backdrop to this verse. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. And they asked Herod, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." Now this is a lovely picture, I think, which I found subsequently from our last talk, which is from an organisation that has produced this DVD. Now, amazingly, I wanted to get this DVD because I wanted to follow up my last talk with this, if you remember, talking about the earthquake at the time of the Crucifixion. But it was part of a double package, and the other DVD in the set was the Star of Bethlehem. It's come from the same source. It's come from this person, Rick Larson. And I'm now going to play a little clip from this one.
Let's take a look and see what John describes. He says, a great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven. What is the sign? Well, I want you to watch this. It's a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon at her feet, a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his heads. If you understand this, please email me, okay? His tail swept 1/3 of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that he might devour her child the moment it was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. Hey, here's that scepter again. Who's the child? That's Jesus in his role as King of Kings. We saw the prediction in Genesis, and here in Revelation, he appears again, and he's got that scepter, because he's now the King of Kings. So, if the child is Jesus, who's the woman? Yeah, that's pretty easy. Okay. And in metaphorical terms, who's the dragon that waited at the foot of the woman to devour the child? That's Herod. The dragon is Herod. John elsewhere tells us in Revelation that the dragon is Satan, but we know in human terms it was Herod. So we now understand what he's describing is the birth of Jesus, but he sees it in the heavens. I'm going to show you something now that definitely got all the little hairs up on the back of my neck and the back of my arm. And because what follows Jupiter into the sky as we animate the sky is Virgo, the Virgin. And she is clothed in the sun. And she has the moon at her feet. It's just a crescent moon, a very small crescent, barely visible moon. There's a reason for that. This is Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah. The sheer weight of symbolism in the sky on this day blew me away. In September of 3 BC, when Jupiter is coming in close conjunction with Regulus, the king planet and the king star, that happening in Leo, the lion representing the nation of Judah, the tribe of Judah, that rises in the sky, and behind it rises Virgo, the Virgin, and she's clothed in the sun, and she has the moon at her feet. It's exactly what John describes in Revelation 12. It's what he saw in his vision. It's obvious. That got me. When I went on the time forward and saw that rise and realized, oh my goodness, that's what John saw. There it is. That really let all the hairs come up.
You can watch the whole of that presentation on the website starofbethlehem.com, which I would recommend. I believe these points with all my heart. I believe it now. It's absolutely foundational for me now. Herod died in 1 AD, 1 CE, before the Passover of that year. And according to this astronomical event, the star, I put it in inverted commas, appeared in the east in September 3 BC. And I also believe this with all my heart. The Magi get to Jerusalem within 2 years. We'll get to see why that is so in a moment. This is what it says in Matthew chapter 2. We know something about Herod's temper now, don't we? Then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry, and he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and in all its districts, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men. Now, I mentioned to Jeremy probably a week or so ago about I was trying to reconcile all of the information and create a timeline. I didn't think it was possible to do it. But this, what I'm going to show you now, was a total revelation to me. Now this has got a lot of data on it, and we'll go through it just step by step, but rather quickly. It's an Excel file, it's a spreadsheet that I created where I tried to put in all of the facts that we have learnt together thus far and are available. On the left-hand side you have BC, on the right-hand side you have AD. As we've already seen, Herod becomes king in Jerusalem 37 BCE. We also know that the Battle of Actium and also what we called Herod's earthquake takes place in 31 BCE. Augustus, who was victorious in the Battle of Actium over Mark Antony, becomes emperor in 27 BCE. As we talked about last time, Herod's temple is begun in and around 20 BCE. What we're suggesting now is that the birth of Jesus takes place around September 3 BC. Up to 2 years afterwards, the Magi visit both Herod initially, and then they come to see the child Jesus, who's in a house somewhere in the vicinity of Jerusalem, around 1 BC. Herod dies before Passover in the year 1 CE or 1 AD. There's no 0 year. Tiberius becomes emperor in 14 AD. Now this is amazing now. Jesus' ministry begins around 28 AD, which happens to be the 15th year of Tiberius, which Luke tells us in the text in his Gospel. Also, we know that Jesus was 30 years old. And he is crucified possibly around 31, but we can't be absolutely precise because we do not know exactly how long Jesus' ministry was, except we know that there were 3 Passovers which are mentioned in John's Gospel. The other amazing thing is this, folks, which in my mind is the icing on the cake. The temple had been existing at the beginning of Jesus' ministry 46 years, which is exactly what it says in John chapter 2, verse 20. The amazing thing from my point of view is that this timeline actually works. It's amazing. Every fact of history, but more particularly every fact in God's Word, all come together. Which means, I believe with all my heart, that Jesus was born now around September 3 BC, and that Herod died before Passover in 1 AD. Let's think a bit more about Herod. I believe that he is an archetype of the Antichrist. This is brought out a little bit in the clip that I showed from the film The Star of Bethlehem. Here are 2 other archetypes of the Antichrist. Antiochus Epiphanes. This is in the days of the Maccabees and the establishment of the Hasmonean dynasty. And here's another one that I believe we will talk a little bit more about in the next talk, if I can ever get to it. Herod the Great, I think we come to understand, is a tyrant and a murderer. He had at least 9 wives, one of whom was executed, Mariamne, the first, I believe. And he executed at least 3 of his own sons. Antipater was one, which we already mentioned. and he died before Passover. And that, to my mind, this was a revelation to me. He died just before Passover, maybe little time before Passover. And so it brings an added significance to this verse, or two verses that we could possibly easily just skip over. So he, that's Joseph, got up, took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod in 1 AD. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Of course, it's a parallel account to what took place during the exodus of the Israelites out of Egypt at Passover time. And I think that is really significant personally. Herod died before Passover. So why do we call him Herod the Great if he is such a tyrant and a murderer? Well, we talked about that a little bit last time. He was a great builder, no doubt. Here's his fortress, which is Masada, which is the most visited tourist site, well, when we have tourists again, I suppose one might say, in Israel, actually. This mountaintop fortress, which was the last stand against the Romans in the 1st century, but more particularly the winter palaces, and I mentioned those last time, and I'm going to flash up a picture. This is not just for Lou, this is for all of us. This is Hannah Ben Haim. And Hannah came to see us this week, which was beautiful. We're very, very close to Hannah. And I'm hoping that she'll take us one of these days. But here's an advert, folks. Why not think, when the lockdowns are over and we can move freely, why don't you think of all of you coming to Israel? And we'll have Hannah as our guide. Okay? Let's think about that one. But Hannah came here this week, and I asked her if one day she might take us to see Herod's winter palaces. I showed you these pictures last time, Jean-Claude Golvin's picture, and he built 3 palaces around the Wadi Kelt. This first one was destroyed in the earthquake of 31 BC. This is his second one, which was built after the earthquake. And this is the third one that was built around 14 BCE, which was bigger still. But this is a point that really I didn't amplify as much as maybe I could have done, because in that earthquake of 31 BCE, it's quite possible, it wouldn't be at all surprising, if Jerusalem itself was very badly damaged. And of course this would give Herod the opportunity for his rebuilding projects. Now this is an interesting one. A hippodrome, a sports arena, very, very close to the temple. I put a question mark here because there's no evidence for it. No archaeological evidence for it at all. And there's an incredible reason for that, which we might talk about next time. When Hadrian, the Emperor Hadrian, in the 2nd century AD, actually ploughed Jerusalem up and created a new city, which was called Aelia Capitolina. So there is no archaeological evidence of this. So how do we know about it? Any clues, folks? Any ideas? Yes, we go back to Josephus, and this time we're looking at book 15, chapter 8, stanza 1. And I wanted just to put this up as the heading of that chapter, which you will find in Josephus' writing. Chapter 8, how 10 men of the citizens of Jerusalem made a conspiracy against Herod for the foreign practices he had introduced. And this is what it goes on to say. Herod revolted from the laws of his country and corrupted their ancient constitution. he appointed solemn games to be celebrated every 5th year in honour of Caesar, and built a theatre at Jerusalem. They were indeed costly works, but opposite to the Jewish customs. Now, the amazing thing about this is history is repeating itself, because in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes, we read this in the books of the Maccabees, so they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem according to Gentile custom, and removed the marks of circumcision, and abandoned the Holy Covenant. They joined with the Gentiles and sold themselves to do evil. So this just underlines the fact of what I believe is that, like Antiochus, Herod was an archetype of the Antichrist. And there is no evidence for this archaeologically because of what Hadrian did in the 2nd century AD. However, we got Herod's temple here. What can we say about it? I wanted to repeat what I said last time because Carol felt I hadn't explained it well enough. So now we're in chapter 11, how Herod rebuilt the temple and raised it higher and made it more magnificent than it was before, as also concerning that tower which he called Antonia. This is the Antonia fortress, which perhaps we have heard about. And again, we've got dating here. And now Herod, in the 18th year of his reign, and after the acts already mentioned, undertook a very great work, that is, to build of himself the temple of God, and make it larger in compass, and to raise it to a most magnificent altitude, to bring it to perfection, and that this would be sufficient for an everlasting memorial of him. I'm just highlighting something here. Now, this is the point. I went on and said this, but I didn't explain it well enough. Josephus writes that Herod said to the Jewish leadership, and these are the words of Herod: "Our fathers, when they were returned from Babylon, built this temple to God Almighty, yet," this is Zerubbabel's temple, "yet does it want 60 cubits of its largeness in altitude. For so much did that first temple," that's Solomon's temple, which Solomon built, that's what it says, "exceed this temple," that's Zerubbabel's temple. "For it was not their fault that the temple was no higher." That's the words of Herod. This is Josephus. They, the Jewish leadership, were afraid that he, Herod, would pull down the whole edifice, Zerubbabel's temple, and not be able to bring his intentions to perfection for its rebuilding. Herod told them that he would not pull down their temple till all the things were gotten ready for building it up entirely again. So Herod took away the old foundations and laid others. He did an awful lot more as far as the Temple Mount is concerned, and we'll discuss this more next time, and erected the temple upon them, being in length 100 cubits and in height 20 additional cubits. There were problems with the foundations, actually, as it turned out. So I believe we can be confident in this, that Herod's temple replaced Zerubbabel's temple, and because of that, although it's controversial, we can say, at the very least, that it's the third building that was used as a temple. But you could say that it's the third temple. Now, whether that has any significance at all, of course, we're talking about a continuation of the Second Temple period, but the temple has been built by Herod as a memorial to him. Okay, let's leave it at that. But Jesus obviously wasn't so much impressed with the buildings, because he says, "As for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down." That wasn't just in the 1st century, folks. We asked that question last time, and of course we came to the conclusion that maybe the destruction of that temple began when the temple curtain was torn from top to bottom because of an earthquake. And this is not unexpected when we consider what took place in the days of Uzziah. An earthquake that actually had its epicenter in Lebanon nevertheless affected the temple in Jerusalem. In the meantime, a great earthquake shook the ground and a rent was made in the temple. This is in the days of King Uzziah. And the bright rays of the sun shone through it and fell upon the king's face, insomuch that the leprosy seized upon him immediately. We talked about that last time. Now, I showed this last time, going back to the Dead Sea. And this is why I wanted to get the Christ Quake DVD, because this is a photo that's actually taken from that DVD. I was a little bit disappointed, I have to tell you, in the DVD, the Christ Quake, because there wasn't any hard data. And I wanted more data. But this is a picture of Rick Larson. This is, again, another scene from the DVD, the Christ Quake. But I just wanted to point out this person, Dr. Michael Lazar, who is in the production, the Christ Quake. He's an Israeli academic. He actually works in the Laboratory for Applied Geophysics in the University of Haifa, and you see a nice picture of him here. I wrote to him because I wanted the data, and he wrote back to me a really lovely email. Actually, I've had 2 emails from him. Dear Geoff, thank you very much for your email. Yes, I agree. The Dead Sea is a fascinating place. I've been conducting research in the area for over 20 years now, and I never get tired of it. Yes, there is evidence in the field for both earthquakes you mention. At some point in the past, Rick Larson, Christ Quake, wanted me to run some complicated analysis on the 33, he's calling it 33 here, AD layer, to check for volcanic ash. But it was way beyond the scope of my expertise. Anyway, in case you have not seen it, I'm attaching Geoff Williams' article about the earthquake. And this is what Michael says. It was a small event, so I'm not sure it would have been felt in Jerusalem, but I cannot really say. Let me know if you have more questions. All the best, Michael. I was so thrilled to get that reply. But I just wanted to point this out. Geoff Williams' article about the earthquake. He sent it to me, but I'd already found it. Jefferson Williams. Now, I only found this morning. That's the amazing thing. And there is on YouTube a video with Geoff Williams talking about the seasonality of the Jerusalem quake. The thing that is amazing to me is that Geoff Williams is a believer. And so Michael Lazar has a relationship with 2 believers who are seeking the truth about the earthquake at the time of Jesus' death. But this is the paper, and we'll go through it quite quickly. I hope I haven't bored you to tears yet. The amazing thing about Jefferson Williams, you can see his name as the lead author, this is a paper that's been published in an academic journal. Now, don't take that lightly, because it is so difficult for believers in particular who want to support the Bible to get anything published in the academic literature, but here is one that was. And this is the part of the abstract. This is Jefferson Williams. We have tabulated a chronology from a core from Ein Gedi on the western shore of the Dead Sea between deformed sediments due to a widespread earthquake in 31 BC, that's the Herod earthquake, the Battle of Actium, and deformed sediments due to an early 1st century earthquake. The early 1st century seismic event has been tentatively assigned a date of 31 AD with an accuracy of plus or minus 5 years. Now, this is one of the sediments. This is from En-Gedi. Some of you may have been to En-Gedi. This is where David held out against King Saul, if you remember. It's an oasis in the desert. And here is the sedimentary layers, and where they identify the Actium earthquake. This is another picture from that paper, which I've had to lay horizontally to get it on screen. And you can get that paper and you see evidence of the Crucifixion earthquake, which, as we've already read, is dated in and around 31 AD, plus or minus 5 years. And this is figure 2 of that paper, which is interesting because it's not En-Gedi, it is the Wadi Ze'elim. And if you remember, this is where Steve Austin and others, including Rick Larson, actually travel. But he shows this sedimentary layer analysis in his paper, which sort of focuses more on En-Gedi. And here you see the evidence. This is really interesting because not only do you see the disruption, this is the Actium earthquake, which is bigger. You see this other event, but you see also that this was at a time when there was so much more water around, which is interesting. The Dead Sea, or the Judean wilderness in the days of Jesus, was maybe not as we see it today. That's just an extra thought. But you see the Actium earthquake and the Crucifixion earthquake. This is figure 2 of his paper. And this is just a smaller part of it, and you can actually see the disruption that takes place, dated around 31 AD, plus or minus 5 years. But this is interesting to me. This is going back to Michael's email to me. I just wanted to highlight this. Rick Larson, Christ Quake, wanted me to run some complicated analysis on the 33, saying it 33 here, AD layer to check for volcanic ash. But it was way beyond the scope of my expertise. Here's a question. Why do you think Rick Larson wanted Michael Lazar to look for volcanic ash? Why do you think? I don't know, because I haven't talked to Rick Larson, although I'd like to have the opportunity to do so, because I really value him. I think it's because of this. From the 6th hour until the 9th hour, darkness came over all the land. About the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Darkness. We need to think about the darkness. It lasted for 3 hours. What can we say? It's definitely not an eclipse. The light has disappeared from the sun. Is it due to ash being in the air? And that is why Rick Larson wanted Michael Lazar to look for volcanic ash in that sediment. Could there be other reasons why for 3 hours the sun has turned to darkness? And that's something else that I want to think a little bit about more, particularly when we think of the future. The fact is, it's a prophetic motif. And Peter quotes Joel in his sermon on the day of Pentecost. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord. But it's also the fulfillment of another prophecy. This is in the book of Amos. In that day, declares the sovereign Lord, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. I will turn your religious feasts, that's interesting, into mourning and all your singing into weeping. I will make all of you wear sackcloth and shave your heads. I will make that time like mourning for an only son and the end of it like a bitter day. The interesting thing is that Amos gives his prophecy, which is looking forward in time, 2 years before the earthquake. So he is implying that this darkness could well have something to do with the earthquake or the earthquakes that are still to come. The fact is, there was an earthquake when Jesus died. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the rocks split. And we've already seen this picture. Now, here's something that I feel strongly about, but I know it's going to be controversial. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, that includes the tearing of the temple curtain from top to bottom, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." Of course, this is in the midst of darkness as well for 3 hours. Now, when the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, where were they standing? I know that this might not be acceptable, but I believe it. They were looking from the Mount of Olives, because it's only from the Mount of Olives that you could see what was happening within the temple itself, that is, the tearing of the curtain. And also, of course, being part of the great shaking that was taking place at this time. What am I saying? I'm saying that Jesus was crucified on the Mount of Olives. And this is a wonderful picture that's taken from the Atlas of Israel, published in 1985, which shows the earthquake fault line running from east to west, or west to east, through the Mount of Olives. In fact, if it's similar to the Dead Sea transform fault, it is, as I have indicated on this diagram, a transform fault where the two sides of the fault are going in opposite direction, creating a great shaking and an earthquake. Again, remember Uzziah? This is Josephus, book 9, chapter 10. This is what happened in the days of Uzziah, the Amos earthquake. Before the city, at a place called Erogi, half of the mountain broke off from the rest on the west and rolled itself 4 furlongs and stood still at the east mountain, which is the Mount of Olives, till the roads as well as the king's gardens were spoiled by the obstruction. And this was another map, and where I identified Erogi being close to the king's garden, called today Ein Rogel. And you see the blue arrows are looking at the movement from west to east along this fault line. It's the same geological fault. Now, the Lord has designed the landscape. He's designed it for a purpose. Part of that purpose has already been fulfilled, and part of it will be fulfilled in the days to come. This is not haphazard. either the Dead Sea transform fault, which has so affected the history of Israel, past, present and future, and this earthquake fault that takes that transform fault into the heart of Jerusalem, close to the temple, through the Mount of Olives. It's not haphazard. It's designed for a purpose. This is a picture of the Mount of Olives. And I thought of this song. There is a green hill far away, without a city wall, where the dear Lord was crucified. He died to save us all. I know it cuts across traditional thoughts and ideas, but I believe that Jesus was crucified on the Mount of Olives, and there's another reason for that. I'm not alone in that, because I had a very dear friend called Gary Collett who also believed that. You see, there is on the Mount of Olives the Church of St. Mary Magdalene. Maybe some of you have seen it and been to Jerusalem. There is within the grounds of the Church of St. Mary Magdalene a first century tomb that is kept secret. Like Mount Sinai, I really believe the Lord does not want his people to spoil what is the most sacred place on the planet, with Mount Sinai being a close second, where God gave the law to Moses. I don't think he wants us to discover these places. I think he wants to keep them for himself. He doesn't want a church of the Holy Sepulchre built over it. The Garden Tomb is a beautiful place. I don't doubt it. But in order to fulfill all the aspects and the descriptions that are in the Gospels, I believe that Jesus was crucified on the Mount of Olives. And it goes on to say this: the tombs broke open, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs, and after Jesus' resurrection they went into the holy city and appeared to many people. Matthew chapter 27. There were lots of tombs around. And this is the Mount of Olives today. It's a giant cemetery, Jewish cemetery. Perhaps you've seen it. Why on earth would people, particularly holy or righteous or Orthodox Jewish people, want to be buried on the Mount of Olives? Because they know their scriptures. They know that Messiah is coming to the Mount of Olives, and that day will be a day of resurrection. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as he fights in the day of battle. On that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west, forming a great valley with half of the mountain moving north and half moving south. This is it. This is the fault line, folks. It's going to be an amazing time. And in the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a tomb which nobody had ever been buried in. This isn't it. I know this isn't it, but it's an example of a tomb which could be like the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, who took down the body of Jesus from the cross and buried it in his own tomb. Now, Arimathea, nobody is quite sure where it is, but because he was an Orthodox Jew, a member of the Sanhedrin, if he was going to be buried, he would want to be buried on the Mount of Olives. And this is an example of a tomb. Maybe it was like his. Of course, the stone rolled away. There was a violent earthquake, aftershock. For an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and going to the tomb rolled back the stone. This is to be continued in the next talk. And in the next talk, maybe we will consider Cataclysm in terms of the history of the Temple Mount, past, present and future. Until next time then, folks. That's it.